Today's review has been the most requested review from our commenters for about 6 months now, and it's not even a piece of silicon. The Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 series has gotten heavy community interest because of high reported performance in the enthusiast forum user base. We wanted to look at it with our new testing methodology that we started developing back when this thing came out in the last half of 2019 to see how the Liquid Freezer performs against incumbents, including the NZXT Kraken X62, the Noctua NH-D15, and a growing list of others. The Liquid Freezer's biggest marketing point, currently wedged in between being a gimmick and being a useful feature, is its included VRM fan on the Coldplate housing. Our review includes benchmarks of VRM thermal performance with and without this fan, tested in A/B fashion, and also tests surface levelness, CPU core thermals on the 3950X and 3800X at 120 watts and at 200 watts, and noise tests, and time to max temperature. We'll be looking at all of that and more in today's review of the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. As with most liquid coolers, there's a lot of different radiator sizes for this, but we have the 280 that we're reviewing today. We've done dozens of liquid cooler reviews over the past 3 years or so, and then we've just booted up our new test bench that includes air cooler reviews. And critically, our new test bench, we started working on the methodology back when we knew this was coming out but wasn't yet out. And because of that knowledge, we were able to bake in the VRM thermal tests early. So we've been slowly collecting this information, and we can finally look at whether this included 40 millimeter VRM fan on the top of the pump housing actually does anything, or if it's a complete gimmick as opposed to being only partially a gimmick for reasons that we'll discuss later. The pump is part of the block on this one. It's actually, you can see the round part back here is where the impeller is located. We're going to do a separate teardown video of this cooler, so if you want to see how it's assembled and how it works, check back for the teardown. We're waiting for a couple more to come in. That way we can tear one down that we didn't do a week of testing on. And other than that, the VRM fan plugs in separately down here. You cannot control it through BIOS, but it's also fairly quiet. So, I mean, you can't hear it over the rest of the system noise is really what the important thing is. But that connects at the bottom. You can disconnect it if you wanted to. We did A/B tests where that was connected or disconnected. Other key features for this one primarily come down to just the fact that they've shoved the cables inside of the cable or the tube sleeving, which is something that Fractal did a couple of years ago on its subpar Celsius series, and now we're seeing carried forward here with the Arctic cooler. No fancy RGB LEDs to speak of, but that also benefits the price. The reason this one's so interesting to a lot of people is because reportedly, and you'll see this today, it's a very good performer, but also it's $95 for the 280 mil version. At that point, you're competing with the EVGA CLC 280, which was the previous best value 280 CLC you could get. It was close to the 120 mark for a while anyway. It might be like 112 now. And something like an NZXT Kraken series X63 or X62, you're spending $150, $160 for basically a bunch of LEDs, because otherwise the thermal performance 280 to the next, especially if they're all Ace Attack, it's not all that different. So the delta in price alone is massive, and the next big question outside of thermal performance, which we're going to look at today, will be on endurance, which we can't obviously test within a review cycle. So that's going to be something we'll have to revisit if something goes wrong in the future. We can speak to the modern Ace Attack coolers as lasting generally a very long time. So the NZXT units, we've had probably about 8 or so X61s and X62s in deployment since they came out. Those have a warranty of 6 years, and extreme permeation is expected to typically set in around the 6-year mark, at which point you could maybe refill it if you had to. But depending on the climate you're in and the use case and how intensive it is, you might have extreme permeation at this point. This one, we don't know where that's going to hit, but if it follows the design philosophy of most coolers, then it should be around the same period, but it's got a much shorter warranty at, I think, 2 years, depending on the region you're in. A couple of things before we get into the thermal numbers. First of all, we revised our testing methodology. We have a video and an article linked in the description below. It's the same content. Pick whichever one you prefer and read up on that to understand how we do this testing. We're not going to recap it every time. It'd take too long. Secondly, when we do noise-normalized testing, there was some misunderstanding about this, and we've been trying to make sure it's really clear. Noise-normalized testing is a term you'll hear a lot with us. We've been using it for years now. What that means is we set the product as it is to the same noise level as every other product. So we set them all to some fixed noise level that we've chosen at a 20-inch distance, but we don't change the fans. So normalizing for noise does not mean normalizing for fans. We use the fans as they are mounted on the device, and we set the same noise level. So I want to make sure that's very clear. Let's get straight into the thermal results, and we'll start talking more about the build quality, the ease of installation, all that stuff towards the end. Our next chart will be the VRM fan performance, but we'll start with the one that everyone is used to. For this one, we're using a 200-watt workload with the AMD R9 3950X, which is more useful for stressing the differences in the high-end coolers. This test is equalized to 35 dBA in order to level the playing field so that coolers can't just brute force their way to the top like the EVGA CLC360 would do with its 60 dBA baseline for noise at 100% speed. The Liquid Freezer 2 ends up as the top performer on the bench when noise normalized to 35 dBA across the board. The Arctic Liquid Freezer results were benched 6 times each with and without the VRM fan, and with 2 sets of remounts plus additional tests of 3 to 6 times each for the 3800X and for the 100% results later. The deviation run to run across the board was under 1 degree, so consistency was good. The 52 degree load result has the Liquid Freezer 2 about 2 degrees cooler than the X62 at the same noise level. It's outdoing the X72 and the CLC360, which both struggle particularly at these lower noise levels because they have too many fans at too small of a size, and so they lose pressure, which they need to push air through the radiator effectively. The NH-D15 is outdone by about 6 degrees Celsius by the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, which is enough to allow some potential for additional overclocking headroom. At the $95 price, the Arctic 280mm solution is kicking everyone's ass, especially the NZXT Kraken X62 or X63, basically the same thing, which aren't anywhere close in pricing. The X63 is newer, it's about $10 cheaper at $150, but that's still massively hiked over the Arctic solution. And if you're going only for function and for cooling, outside of reliability, which is yet untested, the Arctic is doing better. The Corsair A500 air cooler gets buried even deeper than it was at launch. The NH-D15 or the Assassin 3 still have all of their same uses they always have, mostly related to those discussed in the air versus liquid content, like reliability and overall simplicity. Other CLCs will mostly come down to LEDs or warranties. The Liquid Freezer, again, isn't yet tried for reliability, and that's a huge component of coolers that we have no way of accelerating for a review. So we'll just have to see how it does over time. The next test will be for the VRM fan. For this, we're going to start with an overlay demonstrating the linear feet per minute flow, often called FPM or LPM, as measured with a hot wire anemometer at the edge of the chassis for the cooler. The measurement is taken at an angle toward the VRM heatsink, and the chassis here is defined as the pump block housing typically, so that'd be where the Coldplate is. We measured at a few points and under a few conditions. For this image, the VRM fan was enabled and the radiator fans were disabled, as was room AC. The FPM baseline was 0, meaning that air was almost literally not moving in the room. We like to simulate a tomb where we work. North of the socket, aligned with the top center of the cooler and the center of the fan opening in the housing, the FPM measured between 190 and 212 for linear feet per minute flow. It fluctuates as usual with fine air movements, but that's about the range we got. The northwest corner of the cooler, measured at the top left screw of the mount, measured at about 197 FPM toward the VRM. The upper left side measured at 422 FPM, as we seemed to find the exact angle at which the air exits the chassis the fastest and hits the VRM, and then the mid-left side fell to about 96 FPM as we were approaching the edge of the chassis opening and getting into the area where it would no longer cool. The next measurement is at 100% fan speed, with the radiator mounted approximately 1 centimeter away from the edge of the board. This is a similar distance to what you'd find in a lot of cases with fans blowing toward the motherboard in this instance. In this configuration, linear feet per minute flow is about 266 to 275, with the radiator fans blowing and the VRM fan off and measured on the other side of that solid VRM heatsink block, FPM predictably drops down to 64 to 66. This is obviously still plenty high on the other side of the heatsink, the side towards the fans, It's actually above 400 FPM, so it's not like all of the cooling for the VRM has vanished. That said, if you front mount your radiator, having the VRM fan on the block could be somewhat beneficial in scenarios where an overly hot configuration is used, where you have no fans at all in the top or the rear of the case. Then it would help, but most people should have at least one in one of those positions. Before moving to the VRM thermal chart, a few important points that we need to go over. First, this is all relative, so our measurement points aren't designed to test a motherboard, but rather to test the cooling capabilities of the CPU cooler on top of it. We're taking VRM measurements at points that will work best for testing cooler impact, since we don't care about the comparative VRM performance from one board to the next, and we're not looking to see if the VRM is any good. Second, we'll show the numbers with the radiator mounted on the side of the bench. That's how we tested all the liquid coolers so far, as it's more similar to a top-mounted radiator in a case. This means that there's always airflow over the VRM heatsink in all of the CLC tests, whereas testing it on the table away from the VRM would paint a picture of Arctic's VRM fan having a higher relative impact, since you'd be taking away all other cooling otherwise. We have those numbers too, but let's focus on the 3950X OC numbers with the radiator fan at 35 dBA once again, and with the Arctic VRM fan at 100%. The test is also tough to standardize since every motherboard will have different heat sinks and positioning. So although you can mostly extrapolate out a hierarchy, it's not perfectly comparable to every configuration. And again, please also remember that case configuration is the single most impacting to the VRM thermal performance outside of the actual VRM design and cooling solution. What we're saying is that this test will create an objective hierarchy, but that in all reality, a couple degrees here and there in a controlled test for this won't really matter that much when considering the VRM is unlikely to melt itself in the majority of instances anyway. Here's the chart. The Arctic Liquid Freezer's VRM fan is both a gimmick and not a gimmick. It's Schrodinger's VRM fan. It's not a gimmick because it actually works. The top result is with the VRM fan on, measuring at 34.7, 38.3, and 28.4 degrees over ambient for our 3 measurement points. And remember, these are averages of averages, so you're talking probably a couple thousand cells of data at that point. The liquid freezer with the VRM fan off loses a few ranks, consistent across all 12 of the total test passes for this one chart, and we have about 24 test passes for the other 3 configurations we ran as well. The result increases in temperature from 28.4 for VRM2 to 33.6, a change of about 5 degrees Celsius, and from 38.3 to about 42.6 on VRM1. So yes, it actually works and is therefore not a complete gimmick. At the same time, it's not really relevant. It doesn't hurt to be cooler, of course, but this one feature shouldn't be the tipping point between you buying the product and not. If it's between this cooler and another cooler, and you mostly have your heart set on the other one for visual, compatibility, or warranty reasons, then don't let the VRM fan alone sway the decision. If your board is going to run so hot that you need an extra 5-degree reduction, it's probably time to find another board or case solution altogether. That said, this does reduce temperature, and it does work. And in cases that are really hot and closed off, with something like a 3950X or a higher power consumption chip with overclocking and with a VRM, which is undercooled and overheated, this would be a value add. We just don't think that's a very likely or common scenario for people spending that kind of money on a 3950X. And while it gets praised for doing a good job in chart topping, we don't think it should be the deciding factor in the purchase, since again, an extra couple degrees if it's already that hot, you're in trouble anyway, and it's time to find more than just that solution. The next chart is quick. This is our time to steady state at a noise-normalized 35 dBA, or the time at which we reach equilibrium on the 3950X. Liquid coolers take longer to reach equilibrium than air coolers as a result of their water capacity that soaks rapid heat changes better. Big air coolers have well-marked advantages, mostly the install and forget benefit, but also reach steady state in a quicker time, about 90 seconds for these ones with the thermal load that we're testing with. Liquid coolers afford longer periods of low thermals for bursty workloads and can be helpful if you're trying to help control or soak fan speed changes with any kind of fan curve. That's discussed in the previous video, but the Arctic cooler is the new item for this chart. We found the Liquid Freezer 2 280mm CLC reaching steady state in approximately 311 seconds, or about 5.2 minutes. That's a longer period than the Kraken X62 and the 260-second interval, or 4.3 minutes, which is one of our bench toppers currently. The X72 and the CLC 360 do poorly here overall, mostly because the noise requirement is low enough that while the fans are small and in this instance plentiful, they struggle to reach that static pressure requirement to compete with the 280 CLCs. The CLC360 takes the longest to reach steady state here, and it's not just because it has more liquid in the tank, it's because it's burning in this test. It becomes a matter of the liquid temperature running higher on average than the Kraken or the Arctic series by a couple degrees. That's why there's an asterisk next to that one. The data isn't directly comparable. Our next chart continues with the 3950X 200 watt load, but allows all of the coolers to run at 100% fan speed during the test. This doesn't really move the needle that much for Arctic, which seems to top out in its efficiency at around 1200 RPM rather than the maximum 1600 RPM. The results were plus or minus 1 degree as usual, but our average ended up at 50.9 degrees over ambient. That's not really much of a change, and it's not enough of a change to justify the extra noise from the fans. So there's room to reduce the noise level if you buy this without much loss in overall performance. At the 1610 RPM, the Arctic cooler ran at 42.5 dBA at the normal 20-inch distance. This puts it about equal in thermal performance to the NZXT Kraken X62 and X72, which run at 51 or 53 dBA depending, or a perceived noise increase to the human ear between the Arctic cooler and the Kraken series of about 2x. Again, that's perceived noise loudness to the human ear, not acoustic power. Those are different scales. Either way, Arctic solution is significantly quieter at the same performance. The EVGA CLC360 shows that we're not limited by our test bench. There is room to improve still, but it also shows that jet engine levels of noise are needed to drive the temperature down further on a larger radiator, a 360 instead. Moving briefly to the 3800X, we have to issue a reminder that this CPU is tested with completely different voltages and overclock settings, not to mention the fact that it's physically different in dies, but also physically different as a CPU. This would be the same if we tested with a different 3950X too. The IHS is different, the silicone adhesive is different, everything's different. So these are not directly comparable to the 3950X results. It's just a lower power test to show you another look at things. The 3800X was intended to be our standardized platform before we got to these high-end coolers. The charts level off a bit with the big air coolers here and the liquid coolers, as discussed in 2 of the recent cooler videos we did. The reason they level off, just to quickly recap, is because the heat load isn't enough and the gap between the coolers begins to shrink. These larger coolers do better at showing their differences once there's a higher heat load that can stress the smaller coolers beyond what they're really capable of. This is why the NH-U14S does so well relative to the larger air coolers in this specific test. For the Arctic freezer at 35 dBA, we see a 51 degree load temperature, putting the cooler just below the Kraken X62 while remaining significantly cheaper. Idle temperatures also plot the lowest for Arctic, not that this is particularly useful, and that's partly because of the VRM fan slightly reducing the heat in the area of the socket, which does end up affecting the CPU temperature as well. For tests which leave the frequency to auto but control the voltage, we instead report on frequency rather than the thermal outcome. Note that the best frequency doesn't mean it's the coolest, it becomes a touchier subject since frequency jumps around to begin with, and because a better cooler means Precision Boost 2 will kick in for a higher frequency automatically, which creates more heat, so it's not as reliable or simple of a metric, but as long as you've got the error baked in, it's okay. For auto frequency and normalized to 35 dBA, the Liquid Freezer 2 chart tops with the 3800X at 4253.5 MHz all-core average. This is followed closely by the big air coolers. The NH-D15, the Dark Rock 4, the Deepcool Assassin 3, et al. Are all within error and test variants, as is the Corsair A500. Gaining an extra 50 MHz over a high-end cooler, or high-end air cooler at least, is about the difference that you can expect if you're not planning to overclock. The X62 would be in here as well with the Arctic cooler. It's not like that's going to equate an FPS advantage that's noticeable to the human eye. It'll increase it a bit, and it might help render times extremely marginally. We're talking seconds on the hour, maybe half a minute on the hour. It's not worth stressing about, but it's another small benefit of having a better cooler. Our next test is for the levelness of the Coldplate surface, measured with special precision instruments that we've used for testing with most recently the Corsair A500 to show its biggest pitfalls. It helped to illustrate where the A500 went wrong, and in that instance it was the levelness of the Coldplate causing large gaps that required more TIM to fill than was reasonable for a $100 product. This shows the delta in height measured in microns from a calibrated 0 point. The A500's box plot shows the largest range, illustrating the chaotic levelness that hurt its performance so much, while the Deepcool Assassin 3 and original Wraith coolers have some of the best surface levelness. The Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 averaged about 8 to 10 microns of depth from the known 0 point, with minimums and maximums at 2 microns and 48 microns respectively. The Liquid Freezer 2 has a couple deep points in the cold plate, but is overall closer to smooth than unlevel. Our last point is on installation and mounting hardware. Coolers typically differentiate themselves by falling into one of two categories for ease of installation. You can either install it literally single-handedly, like you can with Asetek coolers, or you need 3 hands, a forehead, and some tape to install it. Liquid coolers typically fall into the easier camp, and that's often because the mass of the cooler against the socket isn't as stressful for the board, so less meticulous, fine-tuned mounting hardware is required than with a massive, heavy cooler. It's easier to seat a couple of threaded screw caps onto a backplate to hold it all in place, and then drop the cooler down and install some more cap screws. The Liquid Freezer 2 is not one of those. It's not the easiest we've worked with. It's not terrible, but basically you'll want to install this flat on the table. So if you can, if you don't need to install the radiator into the case first, ideally what you do is you seat the AM4, if you're doing AMD or Intel, same thing, but you seat the back plate under the motherboard, put it flat on a table, and then socket it. Because you only have 4 screws for this, and we've got footage of struggling to install it on a test bench where the motherboard is suspended and we don't want to lift it off for various reasons. What you have to do in that instance where you've got either the motherboard's already in a case or it's on a test bench, whatever, when it's suspended in some configuration, you can't rest it flat. You'll need one hand to hold the plate in place, and then you'll need a hand to align the cooler housing, and then you need a hand, a third one. We typically grow them out of our stomach for this, but you might not be able to do that, in which case, I don't know, you might want to see someone about that. That's kind of weird. But anyway, we use our third hand to install the screw. And there's only 4 screws. It's very simple. They've cut down on mounting hardware as much as possible. It cuts down on cost, and in theory, it's simpler. So the only downside is that in the instance where the motherboard's already installed, then yes, it becomes inconvenient. But you could grab some tape, hold it in place for a bit, and then you'll be fine. It's annoying to do. It's not a deal breaker in any way. You install a cooler typically once, maybe once every couple of years, and you'll never need to worry about it again. So this is not a major point other than to say that we'd like to see Arctic consider moving to a system similar to Asetek's or some of the other companies where it's a back plate and then you have basically a threaded rod that holds it in place, and then you socket the cooler on that, and then you put a cap screw on top of it. Very easy. Not a big deal. Kind of a complaint that is going to be more specific to us because we work on test benches where it's already mounted, but it would apply to you too if you had to install it in a case. So that's all there is for the installation. No huge complaints other than the relative ease of it is not as high as we'd like. For the fans, small note, you're going to be working with these dinky cables that are maybe like 2-3 inches or so. So you'll probably want cable extension if you are planning to run to the motherboard, which is what we do because we like to control things directly through different headers so that we can fine tune it. Now, if you're okay with it, you can connect to this splitter, but even this is kind of short, and also you lose some of the control, the finer control that you get by going into the motherboard, so you may need some extension cables. It's one of the complaints. It's, personally speaking, I'm always a little split on the suggestion of saying a company should include extension cables in the box, because if most people don't use them, it's wasteful, and that's bad. And even if you don't care about the waste of it, the e-waste of it, you should care about the fact that your money's still going into it. It's not like it's free. But also, if it's something most people are going to buy, then it does help to include it, and it brings costs down because economies of scale. So anyway, that's about it for the cooler. At $95, the 280 version of this, the one we reviewed today, kicks the ass of the other liquid coolers we've tested so far. The closest thing to this, which is not on this bench, but it's on our other one, on our Intel HEDT bench, would be the EVGA CLC 280. And they're both stripped down for LEDs. EVGA's got a bit more technically, but who cares? They're kind of dumb on that product anyway. And they're similar in price, but the Liquid Freezer 2 is just, it's a better product. We were surprised. We were surprised to see it do as well as it did, not because it should do badly, but because at the performance and the price, you don't really expect it to outperform something like an X62 in a way that is measurable and repeatable. It's a valid result. It's not like it's just error or like it's lost from run-to-run variation. We ran this thing at least think it was at least 12 times for one configuration, and I think we ran 4 configurations. So it should have been over, for sure, over 24 mounts, and it might be more like 36. But anyway, it was a lot of mounts and remounts for the different configurations, and the result was reproducible every single time. So very good product. The price is good. We can't speak to the endurance of it. That's something we always have to caution with liquid cooling products, but to be very clear, the failure rate of liquid coolers overall is extremely low. It's just that the ones that fail are catastrophic and get a lot of coverage. And you can learn all about that in our liquid versus air content, where we break it down in a real fashion. So the only thing you're really left to consider is air instead of this, because in terms of liquid, if you don't care about the looks and you're okay with just blackout and you don't need a bunch of LEDs and an infinity mirror, then this is the one we would buy for liquid at the price. It wins. And for air, yeah, the air coolers are close enough that you can still buy those, obviously, if you prefer the install and forget, or if you're really paranoid about failure of a liquid cooler, which, to again caution people, it's not that common, but it's common enough that there's reason to be if you have a critical system. Then you could consider air, or for other reasons that we've discussed in the air versus liquid video. But that's it. We'll talk about this more in the teardown. Check back for that. Subscribe as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly with this type of in-depth testing. It takes a lot of extra work to do this, and if you support us on Patreon, you'll also get access to some behind-the-scenes episodes where we show some of the procedures that are involved in getting the accuracy of this testing. So thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.